I think I'd like to encourage our international or our guest speakers to, throughout this session, take some notes. I know you have been taking notes in the previous session as well, but the way I'd like to start the final session would be, again, giving the floor to each one of you, asking you to summarize what you are taking away for now, or what are the still remaining burning questions you'd like us to discuss in this session in block 3. In block 2, what we're doing right now until 3:30, I will suggest the topics for discussion. It's related to what's in the program, but I'd like us to focus on the concepts and practices of truth and justice, which is how Farid ended his introduction, asking whether it's reconciliation, which is a condition for truth, or truth, a condition for reconciliation, or whether it goes in both directions. About half of the contexts we are looking at have had or are having truth commissions. The others have not. So again, there's no formula. You don't have to have a truth commission. And it's actually a question whether, if you have a truth commission, how helpful is it? Or what is it helpful for? Or what conditions allow a truth commission to be helpful and which ones not necessarily. So the question I'm asking is practices around truth, truth commissions as one option, the pros and cons, what works, what doesn't, what things to bear in mind. Justice in regards to reconciliation. And taking into consideration something somebody mentioned as sustainability and the need to adapt. Because this is something that will not be addressed in a year, in a few years, this is something that inevitably takes a long time. How can efforts for reconciliation be sustained throughout times? And how can they or do they need to adjust to the changes? There are some contexts, notably the Spanish one, for instance, where probably the policy of forgetting was reflecting a quite broad consensus in society and political sphere when it happened back in '77. But time moves on, conditions change, and there are new requirements. So what may be needed or possible at one given time may be very different from what's needed or possible further down the line. That includes Germany, I think all the contexts you shared before. So I'd like us to reflect on practices of truth and justice and adaptability, or the need for adaptability over time, to get the conversation going. And then we'll do as before with opening up for any other thoughts you want to have. Who wants to give it a start? Maybe those of you who are living or have lived truth commissions, if you wanted to share some of your critical reflections on that experience. Please. Well, I'm not forcing you, but
So we're focusing on the role of truth, right?
Truth and how helpful truth commissions are. Okay.
So as I mentioned in my first comments, the process is currently ongoing. So the work of the Truth Commission in Tunisia has only ended about a couple months ago. And unless you're interested, I'm going to spare the technicalities of 65,000 cases received, of which 30 were economic crimes, and focus more on the conceptualized public criticisms of the truth process itself, and also responses to what truth means in that context. As I mentioned before, the time span of investigation is 58 years. So there's a lot of room for debate of what constitutes truth, and also who can speak on behalf of truth. And this conflict was very much pronounced during I believe there were 13 public hearing sessions, where the public viewed the Truth Commission to have specifically selected groups that, or voices that spoke to a certain kind of truth that wasn't necessarily representative of the larger structural issues that the Commission was trying to address in a relative non-conflict country. And Raquel and I talked about this for a moment during the break. That perception of the public was very much shaped by how a media, both an unreformed media and an unreformed justice system, as kind of parallel processes that led to the way that Brendan described it, the kind of conflictual overlapping processes that make reconciliation a difficult concept to think about or a process to implement. Both the media and this unreformed justice system have very much informed public opinion of what truth is. So who has the authority over truth, whether it's academics, whether they're lawyers and judges, whether they're technocrats, whether they're former members of the state, whether they're political elites, whether they're even perpetrators who are admitting to their own crimes. And then later have also challenged the kind of problems that truth does to a political transformation / democratization process. So the debate right now is about whether or not truth can heal, or whether truth reinforces the fissures that it tried to kind of expose, and with the lack of political support, whether or not truth can actually lead to some kind of, whether you want to call it peace or consensus or turning the page, or the beginning of a reconciliation process. So.
Thank you. You brought up the concept of healing, which has also not come up yet. And I'd invite everybody also to reflect on that in as much as possible. Anyone else on the experience of truth commissions in your own context, or the lack of a truth commission?
I know you've heard from me already, but I'll maybe just say a few things about the South African process and my experience of that. I suppose the first thing for me is that truth has to be linked with other processes, so truth, justice, reparation, the various other processes. Otherwise it can look like you're not dealing with issues. So if we think of South Africa now in retrospect, one of the biggest failings is that we didn't have prosecutions after the Truth Commission. So our truth was linked in with an amnesty, but it was actually for a period of time. So if they had done truth with amnesty and then later some prosecutions, I think you would have had a more rounded picture of how you might address the past. So I think that's the first point. The second, which I alluded to a little bit earlier, was that one of the challenges we had was that because the Truth Commission itself looked at murder, attempted murder, torture, abduction and disappearance, it was very violation focused. So from a reconciliation perspective, if you ask people what do they remember, they'll remember the high profile cases, the dramatic cases of human rights violations, or they might, and there were multiple cases like that, remember where a victim met a perpetrator, where they shook hands as part of that process, or they came together. But it's sort of individualized issues which in the wider South African context were much more about structural forms of violation. So on some level, I think so what that means in the current context is if you speak to people now, they will say to you, the challenge is really about ongoing poverty, racialized poverty. We're not addressing those sorts of issues. And the Truth Commission fed into that sort of a logic. Now, I don't think that's completely true. I think it did. There were politicians at the time who helped shape a wider context. There were other hearings which looked at the role of the media, the role of the judiciary, the role of the business community, the role of the medical profession, the role of churches, to try and create the wider context. So I think at the time it sort of made sense, but now further down the line, it feels like it didn't really address the wider picture. So I think that's a challenge for me about reconciliation in terms of, by going through the vehicle of a truth commission, what you can look at and what you can't look at. So I was, of course, interested in the cases you were talking about, where you were trying to get to some of the more structural, the structural issues, but I think that would be one of the challenges on the South African side.
But are you then suggesting the possibility that this could be revisited now somehow, further down the line, what wasn't addressed in the past?
I don't know if, I mean, I think the challenge is I'm not quite sure what's the right mechanism for dealing with the structural and social injustice related issues. Whether actually a commission is the way you deal with that, I'm not really sure. And if you spoke with people and in South Africa at the time, they would have said, well, there was a land claims court, there was a gender commission, there was a youth commission, there was a restructuring of the economy. These things were not meant to all be dealt through the Truth Commission. That's what people would say. But I'm not sure if a Truth Commission is the vehicle to dealing with that sort of deep systemic forms of relationship damage that needs to be rebuilt. I think it can contribute to that, and South Africa contributed to that. So I'm not sure. I think it definitely needs to be revisited, and it is being revisited. I don't know if I'd revisit it through a commission. I'm not sure what you would revisit social injustice with. You know, and many countries are facing that. You know, the United States, many.
Raquel?
Durante las negociaciones de paz se acordó la instalación de una comisión de la verdad que no individualizaría responsabilidades ni se usaría en juicios. Esto hizo que las negociaciones se suspendieran por casi 8 meses porque la base de la insurgencia no estaba de acuerdo con lo que su comandancia había aceptado. Finalmente hubo acuerdos al respecto porque al final uno de los retos es que de los que firman la paz, es difícil que alguien firme sabiendo que esa firma le va a significar ir a juicio o a la cárcel. Eso es un dilema. Entonces se instala la comisión de la verdad, que yo pensaría que la integración es un punto muy importante, y luego también que esa verdad tenga contexto. No es una narrativa de hechos, sino que tengan también un contexto en el cual se dieron. Asimismo, que antes de oficialmente presentar el informe, sería recomendable que estas comisiones tuvieran sesiones privadas con expresiones del liderazgo nacional que pudieran permearse un poco a lo que se va a recibir, porque de lo contrario es un asunto en países como Guatemala poco acostumbrados a aceptar su pasado. Fue muy fuerte, es una de las guerras más sangrientas que hemos tenido. Entonces se dan las dos cosas. Finalmente el informe ha sido utilizado en juicios, lo cual era acordado que no iba a hacerse, y en ese punto pues siempre la parte no de la insurgencia reclama que es muy difícil individualizar responsabilidades en un grupo insurgente que usa nombres falsos, que tiene una movilidad, que no tiene una ubicación conocida. Entonces hay situaciones donde me parece que ese tema de la verdad, y donde yo repito, en mi experiencia personal, efectivamente las víctimas quieren saber qué pasó, cómo pasó, quieren enterrar a sus víctimas, quieren cerrar ese círculo, les interesa mucho el reconocimiento moral y político de que sus familiares no eran unos delincuentes criminales, sino que estaban en una guerra ideológica en el caso nuestro. Entonces sí creo, finalizando, insistiendo, la conformación de esa comisión, que es muy difícil en una situación tan extrema como la que vivimos, que alguien no esté posicionado. Entonces, en la Comisión de la Verdad de Guatemala hubo un experto alemán, el profesor Tomuchad, pero hubo 2 personas de Guatemala, que les debe haber sido muy complicado realmente tratar la imparcialidad y la objetividad que el acuerdo exigía. De todas maneras, creo que es un gran aporte para entender el grado de crueldad al que se llevó en estos 36 años de guerra.
¿Crees que las expectativas de las víctimas fueron satisfechas con ese trabajo o se podría haber hecho algo diferente?
Pienso que al empezar los juicios, entonces todo aquel que creía que podía, digamos, haber un intercambio de información que llevara a la verdad más no al juicio, ahí se retrocedió. Y las víctimas, creo que con respeto, pero hablando del caso español, cuando nuevas generaciones reivindican su pasado, es una generación de primer mundo. En Guatemala la gente está en pobreza, está en carencias, está con poca educación, entonces el sentimiento más es de cerrar el círculo, obtener el cadáver y saber qué pasó. Al haber juicios, las bocas se cierran, entonces es muy difícil cómo combinar tener las indicaciones de dónde fue la masacre, dónde fue el entierro de los cadáveres y la posibilidad de ir a juicio de quien lo pueda decir. Son dilemas muy fuertes y yo creo que las víctimas siguen estando pendientes en su mayoría y repito, no es reparación económica la que en sí desean. Creo que los ejercicios de salud mental en lo que se han podido llevar a cabo sí han sido muy exitosos para la convivencia.
When the wall came down and the question of how to deal with the communist system raised up in the early 90s, of course, we looked at South Africa, and the debate about having such a truth commission was also in the public. But I think in this special situation where there was the effort to prosecute state crimes with the principles of a constitutional state, there would have been this problem asking people to talk about their crimes or about injustice, and on the other hand having them fear that they will be prosecuted about the things they are willing to talk. And in the special situation where the much bigger West Germany took over in a way the much smaller East Germany, and the majority of the population was very happy to get rid of the political system, there was also not the need of coming to terms with the relatively small numbers of functionaries of the state and the Communist Party. On the one hand side, the post-Communist Party wasn't forbidden. They could gain quite good results in the elections, at least in East Germany, and now they are still, after some transformation in our parliament, with about 10% of the votes. And so instead of such a truth commission, there was a parliamentary commission, the first one in this way, which has been established on an historical subject. This is called Enquête-Kommission. This is a kind of commission which is established for many questions, future questions like future of digitalization or ecology or something like that. And in the early 90s, in 1992, they established such a commission on the history of the German division and the GDR. And the interesting thing, there were two of these commissions, one from 1992 to 1994 and one from 1994 to 1998. The second one didn't interest anybody in a broader scale, but the first one was interesting because it was relatively fresh, and they had a lot of hearings and they paid a lot of money for expertise on different subjects. And so in a way, the Parliament took over responsibility to talk and negotiate the subject. And all the political parties which were in the Parliament, even the post-communists, were able to bring in their own perspectives. So this was one instrument during this time. The second one was prosecution, of course. And the prosecution was difficult because the principle was that something which is dealt on in front of court has to be crime in the GDR itself. So the measurement of killing people at the border or faking elections or something like that was not the West German law put over on the GDR, but they had to use the GDR law because of the so-called Rückwirkungsverbot. Sorry, I don't know the English word for it. It's a legal subject that a law cannot be used for something which had been done before the law was established on the territory. And therefore, there was a lot of uncomfortable feelings on the side of the victims and the people of the opposition, because those politicians, East German politicians who faked the elections, who were responsible, had usually fines maximum 2 years or something like that, and it were only a few dozens. And even those who were who shot people at the border usually didn't go to the prison, because they said, okay, they were in a way only soldiers obeying their instructions, and that we try to sue the people who are really responsible. So in one way, the constitutional state triumphed in this situation, because it accepted that there is no moral dimension by dealing with the problems, only juridical. But on the other hand, in the minority of those people who were really engaged in the subject of coming to terms with the past, they said, well, that was not our idea of overcoming the dictators. We didn't hang them up, but we wanted to have them imprisoned at least. And the third thing was that we had, from the very start, from the year 1990 onwards, a very, very lively concurrence of interpretations of the history. So the question of history was in fact part of the peaceful revolution itself. During the last weeks of the SED regime, the communist regime, in October, November 1989, there were a lot of talks and discussions about the political purges in the Communist Party itself. So when they lost their power after the wall came down, historical questions were suddenly very, very present. And even on the huge demonstration on November 4th, when around 500,000 to 1 million people gathered in East Berlin, it was before the wall came down, and people had all these transparents, the organizers were so aware of the historical situation that at the end of the demonstration, they collected the transparents to archive them for the future. This was at a point of time where they didn't know when the wall came down, how the thing developed. So the delegitimization of the political system was always a question of historical subjects from the 45 during the 4 decades of the existence of the German division. And therefore, a lot of money was spent and a lot of initiatives have taken place by, on one hand side, state-funded educational institutions on very different levels, and on the other hand, there was a lot of NGOs which started in 1990, 1991, developing out of the small groups which opposed the political system until the fall of the wall, and afterward they transformed into NGOs organizing museums, opening the Secret Service files, starting to make books and exhibitions and such things. So even in the communist cultural surrounding, they had a lot of scientists, historians who lost their jobs after a while. In the first years, it was all finance for until 1992, 1993. And an absolute massive number of books were printed, the media were full of interviews and articles, and so historical questions, especially after opening the Stasi files, the files of the Secret Service, historical questions were overwhelming subject in the first years. And one thing to end with, of course, the historical debate was always also a part of the actual political debate. So the conservatives or the more leftist political parties try to use historical subjects in argumentation when there were new elections or something like that, want to denounce collaboration of the Social Democrats, or the Social Democrats said, well, all your Christian Democratic Party organizations in East Germany were former Christian Democratic Party organizations run by the SED, by the communists. There were 40 years of opportunism, and afterwards they were suddenly organizing the democratic outcome. And so it took about 15 years until this debate on the history lost its actual political dimension. Now we come to the point where this political dimension is not that strong. And for example, the foundation I'm working for, we are a public foundation financed by the state, but in the executive board and in the Stiftungsrat and the council, there are representatives from all political parties, even from the post-communists and from universities and public sphere, so that there is no possibility, if there is a change in government, to intervene in the work of our foundation. And I think that's very important to have the credibility that you are, on one hand side, of course, convinced that the regime was a dictatorship, but that you are not a kind of instrument of political, daily political fights on the majority in parliaments or on the streets. So, but this is, well, the luxury situation in Germany where there's so much money, and because it didn't affect the majority of the West Germans. So it was something like, well, we have to do it, it's part of our culture, and we will organize it, but it's somehow a matter of the East Germans, and they have to fight it out. And now we slowly come to the point where West Germans start to understand that the things which happened after 1945 in East Germany are also part of their history, like, for example, the National Socialist history, which has taken place decades before they were born. So it's a process of accepting and understanding the German division, the time of German division, as part of the, well, I sometimes say we have got this divided history in two German states, but we share this history, whether you were born in Bonn in West Germany or in Dresden in East Germany. And this is an interesting process, and I'm curious how it develops, since, of course, the question of the GDR history is not that, burdened like the history of National Socialism because of the impact of terror and murder.
Thank you, Uli. I'm pretty sure that if developments continue positively on Korea, for instance, your experience will be highly valued as a reference in that context. Nishchal, you mentioned in the break that you thought Nepal was an excellent example of successful reconciliation. At the same time, you also acknowledged, well, partly also because both the government and the armed opposition agreed not to dig too deep into truth and justice. Can you develop a little bit?
Thank you very much. Yes, and, I think there was a question from a gentleman at the back in the previous session that which one is the perfect or a good example of reconciliation. I would say that Nepal has gone through a successful venture of reconciliation, because the leader of the insurgent group participated in multi-party democratic elections in 2008, won the elections and became the prime minister. So that I think is a good example of how reconciliation efforts have gone by in South Asia. But there are problems coming from there on, and we need to analyze that, because there were Interpol red corner arrest notice against him and against his forces. So when he travels abroad, he is still anxious that there will not be any problems in international transit routes. So last year when he was traveling to Australia, last moment somebody suggested that he should not travel to Australia because there are families of victims based in Sydney who are now declared as refugees. And they were already complaining to the Australian police that this is the man who is coming tomorrow, and he is the one responsible for the disappearance of my parents, etc., etc. So therefore he cancelled his visit at the last moment. So this, I think, the problem remains, and I mentioned in my presentation in the morning, that just because there is a reconciliation, the international community is not going to accept it. Your local law is not going to be applicable as an international law. You may be giving general amnesty, international community is not going to accept it. A murder is going to be regarded as a murder, and there has to be a thorough investigation as regards to these processes, and I think we have spoken a great deal about that. Second thing that I would like to highlight is on reconciliation for the sake of what? And in South Asia, if you have resources, you can easily buy weapons. And there are multiple refugee camps, whether it is the Bhutanese refugee camp or the Rohingya refugees or so forth. And if you have resources, you can always hire unemployed people into your insurgency. So here you are buying weapons from the resources you have, hiring people from the refugee camps, and starting insurgency on some kind of ideology. And then the government will come out and say for reconciliation. So how does that sound? So that is a completely criminal activity. So therefore, I think this whole comprehensive package has to be understood in a holistic manner. That you cannot start an insurgency purely on a criminal basis and then start talking about reconciliation. So I think we need to talk about it in a holistic fashion. And then the role of the external actors come into play. There is a term in English now called conflict entrepreneurship. Conflict has become an industry. There are arms merchants who are willing to supply arms to you, and the money can be paid to them 5 years later. So the weapons are going to be delivered at your house right now, and the payment can be done 5 years later. So this is called conflict industry in South Asia. So this is the way the whole nexus operates, and we need to really go deep into the whole processes of reconciliation. But as far as Nepal is concerned, I think we did pretty well as far as ending the conflict is concerned. 18,000 people died, and the person who led that conflict came into competitive multi-party elections. That much, I think we can assure you that it was an achievement.
Well, that's one way of trying to measure or analyze the success of a reconciliation process, which is inevitably difficult. I was struck, Brandon, in your keynote presentation, you suggested that reconciliation could be measured by managing tensions. How do you measure managing tensions? If you could develop on that a little bit.
Can we do that? Yeah, I'm not sure if you can scientifically manage it or measure it, but the point I was trying to make is that one way of trying to understand if a process is successful or not, or successful perhaps in inverted commas, is how a different society is dealing with, for example, how it's structuring its vision of the future and how it's dealing with the past. So if those processes are going one way or the other, causing huge amounts of social conflict, then at a political level, you're not really fostering reconciliation. So for me, it was thinking about those 5 strands and how we're dealing with them at a political level. And if they're not being addressed, or if it's going too much in one direction rather than another direction, that would be your sort of barometer for thinking about how the reconciliation process is unfolding. So that's what I was thinking about in making that point. It also comes a little bit from the Northern Ireland experience, where those 5 dimensions that we spoke about eventually got incorporated into an EU peace funding program, which was never our intention. But what they did with that was then community projects had to basically say how much work were they doing on each of these dimensions. So it became like a tick box exercise. You had to say, how much you were doing on these things, and how much work were you doing in terms of creating equity in your community, how much work were you doing in terms of building relationships, which was not how we intended it. We intended it to be a more holistic picture. So by saying you would measure reconciliation in terms of the relationship between the 5, for us it's about trying to get away from this idea of reconciliation is just if you have functional relationships. Reconciliation is measured if you have a truth commission, which is a little bit how the international community starts to look at it, like a tick box exercise. We have some civil society programs, we have a truth commission, we have an economic development program, therefore reconciliation is being advanced, rather than thinking about what is the product of those things holistically.
So if you apply the holistic perspective to Northern Ireland, what would you say is the situation? How do you measure reconciliation in Northern Ireland?
So that's what I was trying to say toward the end of the talk, that basically if you looked at all 5 of those dimensions, the current problem we have is a lack of common vision at a leadership level, and that there is no strategy for dealing with the past. And because those 2 things are not in place, a lot of the sort of counter narratives and different ways of looking at the past are now permeating, for example, some of the relationship building work that has been done quite successfully. It's also meant that people have started to reevaluate, although the communities now, if we want to speak at it very generally, are much closer economically than they've ever been before. People are coming back and saying, but somehow people still don't feel equal. And some of that's because they're not addressing the macro issues. Does that make sense?
Does that make sense? Open question?
Well, I think this question is very interesting about reconciliation, and despite the affirmation of Nishal, I think the question is still very pertinent. Had there been real reconciliation in any of the cases? I understand that in Northern Ireland you say in 3, maybe 2 or 3 points we have reconciliation, but in the others not. In South Africa it's vice versa. And in Nepal we have the situation that an electoral process produced a legitimization or legitimate government, but I think we cannot say this is automatically also reconciliation. I don't know whether all these, if we accept more or less the definition, if the different aspects are really fulfilled or achieved in the case of Nepal. I was thinking about Spain. In Spain we have also the case that at the end of the day we have now 40 years of legitimate government, and also those who had been in opposition to the authoritarian regime after a while became government, got elected, and those who from the previous government who went to opposition accepted the government. So the government was without any doubt legitimate government in Spain. But I understand the Spanish speakers that you would not go as far as to speak about reconciliation or full-fledged reconciliation in the case of Spain. Yeah. So so you have a process of legitimization, yeah, and you have a lot of agreement and so on, but reconciliation at the end of the day may be more. So the question is it possible to get any kind of reconciliation, yeah, or to go even a little bit far? Do we need really reconciliation at a certain moment in time when the things are more or less working, as in the case eventually of Spain. Yeah? It is a question, it's not an affirmation.
Well, it is a question that links to the to observations in the introductory comments. What is possible and needed at different moments in time, and I think it is very pertinent. I think it's safe to say, going back to the Spanish case, that that was the best you could have at that time, possibly, and there was a large consensus. I think going back to Nepal, it's undoubtedly quite remarkable that an opposition armed group that was labeled as a terrorist organization runs for elections and wins. Clearly they had bigger levels of support, or were quite smarter in their political campaigning than, for instance, FARC in Colombia, which had a completely neglectable level of support in the elections. So that is indeed a very interesting, and I would say positive, development for political normalization. Now, and that's possibly the best you can get at that time, which doesn't mean that, for instance, victims feel that there has been done justice to what happened to them. I'm not even sure whether victims of communism in the former Eastern Germany feel that there has been justice towards them. The society might feel that there has been, that they are dealing with it very proactively. I'm not quite sure what victims feel if they go with that, by that line or not, or if they accept, well, that's the best we could get anyway. Yeah.
But they are, of course, disappointed, and the reason why they are so disappointed is that they have only one pattern where they can compare the way the society deals with them to another case. And this other case is the way German society is talking about, talking with, and commemorating the victims of National Socialism. So having this pattern in mind, and comparing the honor and the respect which is brought towards them, they always fail, and they cannot understand that, of course, being imprisoned in a GDR prison in the 50s, which was a very, very uncomfortable situation, no way, but that this is not comparable to being imprisoned in a concentration camp and fearing being exterminated. But you cannot explain a 70 or 80-year-old woman or man who was arrested by the Soviets or by the early GDR system, the details of the different systems. They say, well, of course, I have respect for the victims of the other dictatorship, but my pain isn't less than theirs, and I want to have the same audience and the same respect, and therefore. This is part of this memory conflict in Germany, and we have got a lot of laws for rehabilitation of formerly imprisoned or oppressed people in the GDR, and they had special benefits for second education, for going to university or something like that. And if you have been in jail longer than half a year, you have got an additional pension. This was something fought out in the late 90s, in the early 2000 years. But of course, there's always the feeling of not having the same public audience like the victims of the other dictatorship, and this is pretty difficult. And this is, of course, also a result of the still. In a way, undecided. Well, like we have got this problem that not only the victims have got only one way how to deal with the dictatorship. Of course, me and all the other fellow citizens in Germany, we are trained that there's one way of dealing with dictatorship, and this is the way we are doing it with National Socialism. And so we also are unsure how to come to terms with such a second dictatorship. And for example, up to 5 or 10 years ago, if you would have had a closer look onto the way it was talked and educated on these different periods of time of the 20th century, you would have realized that there were, on one hand side, offers on National Socialism, seminars and books and whatever, and on the other hand, about the time after 45. And if you said, well, we have to talk about dictatorship in the 20th century, something they shared and the difference or something like that, you were always in danger that you would hear, you want to equalize the GDR with the National Socialism and such. It was a kind of division of labor in a way. And only in the last 5 or 10 years, we are slowly coming to the point talking about, let's say, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, which were, in a way, the peak period of anti-democratic, anti-human politics in Europe, from the National Socialists in the 30s, and especially in the 40s, from the Soviet Union, from the middle of the 30s until Stalin's death in the 50s. So we are far away from having a language talking about these similar and different periods of history in Germany, but also in Europe. If you have a look at the memory culture of Europe, it is the division of Europe is in a way prolonged over the year 1989. The majority, or the Western Europe memory culture is focused on Holocaust memory, and they have only less knowledge and less empathy for the fate of the Eastern European societies, what they had made through from the 30s until the late 80s. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding, and the present politics, the present problems, for example, with political development in Poland or in Hungary and so on, you cannot understand without knowing about this historical scenery and the different experiences those countries have lived in until 1989, and about realizing in the last 30 years that the discourse of the West European states and of the European Union is not really interested in the history of Eastern Europe. I mean, if you look back on the year 2014, for example, and it will be the same next year, when there's 30 years of peaceful revolution next year, or 25 years of peaceful revolution, the European Union, the European Commission didn't do anything special on this subject. But on a way, if you look on the 20th century and about the development of democracy and dictatorship in the 20th century, the year 1989 was the year of liberation of half of the continent. And if you look on the history of democracy, which started at the end of the First World War and ended in a lot of authoritarian regimes in the National Socialism and the Second World War, it was followed up in West Germany and Western Europe with democracy after the year 1945, but for the Eastern states in dictatorships. And this is not part of the European memory. And I mean, we are talking about reconciliation and experiences, but nobody mentioned that. I didn't realize it before. We have that May 9, and this is the 73rd anniversary of the end of the Second World War in the Russian perspective, because they celebrate the 9th of May. In Western Europe, we celebrate the May 8th, and if we look for an effective and thorough reconciliation process, then we do have to look on Europe, that the tensions between states like Germany and France, or Britain and Germany, are reduced in a way which was unbelievable 73 years ago. You couldn't imagine that we could come to this point. So if we need a positive example that it might work out, you should always think about this situation, which should also strengthen, of course, your hope and your trust into the European Union, because this was, in a way, the result and the consequence out of the division and the decades of extremism in the 20th century. And so everything's in a way connected.
Which gave the European Union the Nobel Peace Prize, but which doesn't mean there's a number of challenges.
That's the point.
Xavier, you wanted to?
Thank you. Very interesting intervention, I think. Desde mi punto de vista, y en un nivel más teórico, yo diría que hay 4 conceptos que deberíamos analizar desde el punto de vista de la tensión que esta mañana el profesor Brandon nos sugería, de estos 5 aspectos que debían estar en tensión, ¿no? Pero en cualquier caso, estos 4 aspectos que me gustaría señalar son, por una parte, el perdón, por otra, el olvido, por otra, la verdad y, al final, la reconciliación. Y que los 4 conceptos pueden actuar a veces como vasos comunicantes, que cuando realmente uno consigue tensionar más a la sociedad, pero superarse, puede influir sobre los otros y aumentarlos, porque, por poner un ejemplo, el nivel de olvido puede ser muy grande en una sociedad que empieza a caminar hacia la reconciliación, pero solo es superable este olvido si realmente hay también un aumento de perdón, un aumento de verdad y un aumento de coexistencia. Yo, como antes ha señalado mi compañera del País Vasco, me gustaría más hablar de coexistencia o de convivencia, de conviviality en inglés, este concepto que es más básico, pero al mismo tiempo más real en un proceso que ha de ser largo y que finalmente puede conducir a la reconciliación, pero no por principio y desde el principio, ¿no? Y entonces, bueno, en este caso, por ejemplo, cuando antes nos ponían el ejemplo de Nepal y de unas elecciones democráticas y que un grupo armado, su líder gana unas elecciones, etcétera, hay otros casos, estoy recordando, por ejemplo, el caso del Salvador, donde esto también se ha dado, y no por eso estos vasos comunicantes se han subido muchos peldaños y realmente se ha conseguido una reconciliación mejor. Yo lo que me gustaría es reflexionar sobre la capacidad que hay de que el olvido sea eterno y que, por tanto, después no resurjan las cosas. Es como la violencia, que tapa los problemas pero no los resuelve. Pues igual que el olvido no puede ser eterno, que el olvido no puede ser absoluto. Y lo mismo pasa con la verdad, porque no hay una verdad. Hay muchos relatos de verdad que hay que escuchar, o el perdón, que no puede ser un perdón indiscriminado y para olvidar las cosas, sino que ha de ser un perdón realmente razonado, etcétera, ¿no? Pues me gustaría poder reflexionar más sobre estos 4 conceptos al mismo tiempo.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm turning it on. Okay. I want to reflect on 2 questions that were raised recently. The first one before the break, do we have reconciliation? And if I look for Bosnia according to your scheme, it appears that we don't have it because we still have many tensions in it. But also I could speak about examples and experiences of reconciliation for ours. But I'm worried about that those initiatives of reconciliation are done on grassroots level, are done by NGOs, and I can see us, my organization, and many other organizations turning those wheels of reconciliation, but just small wheels. The big wheels are still stopped, and it's very easy to sway people back to tensions, and it's usually done on the political level and through media. Also, another question that you raised about do we need reconciliation always if it works? I was drafting the article and I defined reconciliation as impossible because we cannot reach. But there is one thing that we can reach, and if we reach peace, but the real peace, the positive peace, the Galtungs, real peace, without any kind of violence, neither structural, neither cultural, I think in that moment we can say that we don't need reconciliation. Maybe we skipped some points, maybe we didn't discover the truth, maybe we didn't forgive, but it's still possible to reach peace without reconciliation. But if we don't have real peace, and there is no peace in Bosnia, there is no peace on different sides of Europe and of the world as well, then we need to use those instruments and go through those processes. And reconciliation is one of those. So if we don't have peace, we need reconciliation. We are not going to reach any end of it. It's impossible, but we have to strive toward peace, in my opinion.
So building on Xavier's comment, reconciliation as a process or reconciliation as an end. And also related to previous comments from Basque Country and elsewhere, are there many truths? Or is it possible to develop one commonly accepted truth? Or is it possible to live with parallel truths, but which share at least an ethical commitment to not justifying any sort of violence, like the developments in the Basque Country seem to be linking towards? How does that look in practice?
I think I'll just comment on that based on the Rwandan experience. So the key, people can live together and can share everything, but I know there is a debate around the positive peace and like you can reconcile, but I want to have a common vision. We don't have to have violence. We don't have to not help each other. But sometimes people may argue that, okay, I don't have any choice than having a future for my children, avoiding crisis, avoiding argument, but people decide to live together. The question will be, is that really real reconciliation? That, the fact I can let things go. But I think at the same time there is a benefit of it. Personally, I believe there's a benefit of allowing people to understand that they don't have to harm each other, or they don't have to bring the past, but they can move forward together. Not necessarily, we raise the issue of forgiveness, not necessarily to forgive that you did harm to my family or you did something, but people could decide to take a direction of moving forward together. But there is also another important aspect here that is key, which I found it fundamental, which we didn't talk about. It was also the healing. I think if you have not healed your wounds, it's so difficult to really do other things, because there will always be something that is not helping you to move forward. So in Rwanda, one of the things they have done, they have combined three things. One is the healing process, which is allowing people to really deal with the trauma and issues like that. The second is also an economic aspect, that people don't have to meet, or should not only meet because they are going to talk about what happened in the past, but could we provide another platform where people could meet but do something together? So one of the things that have happened in Rwanda, Rwanda is more agricultural things. One of the things is that people have been given or were encouraged to create opportunities to work together by using the land. So for example, if they have to put, let's say, tea or coffee, that's a big land, which in association, everyone will benefit. But people are meeting for various ways. One, they're meeting to work together to create sustainable for their families and income. But at the same time, they're also meeting to talk about the past. So that means that there is also a benefit of, when there's no healing process involved, it's quite difficult. But at the same time, the economic, there is an opportunity that income is key, especially when you have countries where the people are poor. So when there is no income, that can also be exposed to manipulation. As we know, there is an issue when there's a conflict, there's always manipulation. But then people are discussing, are meeting, are dealing with the past, and then they are able also to move forward together. But does that mean some will fully forgive and then move forward? But some others will say, okay, in order for us to move forward is that we put the past aside and then we move together. But doesn't mean that I've forgiven you 100%. But I know you did this, but there's no violence involved, and then the people can do with that. I think that's the only thing I can comment on that.
es que yo, en primer lugar, agradecer muchísimo todas las experiencias que se están compartiendo, ¿verdad? Porque yo desde donde puedo hablar es desde el momento en el que estamos intentando ver qué es eso de la reconciliación, cuáles son los retos que supone y para qué sirve, ¿no? Y todas estas visiones, al principio hablábamos de que no hay un único modelo, ¿no? Yo creo que la pregunta que decía Cristian, la reconciliación como un fin en sí mismo, como un proceso, yo creo que desde la intuición y desde lo que voy escuchando, ¿verdad? Y desde lo que vamos trabajando a nivel local en el País Vasco, pero con esa humildad de diferente dimensión de lo que estamos aquí planteando y de diferente nivel de desarrollo, creo que es un proceso, pero creo que es un proceso que se convierte en sí mismo en un objetivo y en un punto de llegada. Quería recuperar también la idea de lo holístico y de que como no hay un solo, o sea, en este camino de la reconciliación o la convivencia, que a mí me gusta más porque las palabras es verdad que a veces nos unen o nos juntan, y cuando afrontamos un proceso como puede ser el de la reconciliación o la convivencia, que genera tanta incertidumbre, ¿no? Pues hay que gestionar intentar ganar esas primeras confianzas, por lo menos que los términos no sean conflictivos, ¿no? Y nosotros hemos llegado a un cierto consenso de que el concepto convivencia, que iría un poco más allá de lo que comentaba Ives de la coexistencia, ¿verdad? Pero también creo que, evidentemente, igual que durante el tiempo del conflicto, y no sé si ha pasado en otros lugares, pero yo siento en el País Vasco que durante el tiempo que ha habido un conflicto violento, una espiral de violencia, no toda la sociedad ha estado involucrada en la misma medida. Ahora también, en este nuevo proceso, no toda la sociedad se siente involucrada en eso o siente esa necesidad. Pero, entonces, quiero decir ¿qué necesita cada uno, ¿no? Estamos un poco también, los procesos que llevamos a nivel local, por ejemplo, realmente afectan directamente a representantes políticos, pueden ser 7 o 8 personas, y a ciudadanos, que pueden ser 10 personas. Pero lo que estamos viendo es que, aunque hay un deseo de superar el silencio y el olvido, pero también es verdad que no todo el mundo quiere hacer ese tránsito y ese proceso. Entonces, generar espacios para quienes sí sienten esa necesidad, que a la vez es una aportación. Y con el tema de la verdad, más allá de las comisiones de la verdad, y yo yendo a lo más micro, sí creo que tiene que haber diferentes planos de unos espacios más institucionalizados, más macro, donde hay que ver la verdad de todo lo ocurrido. Creo que uno de los retos es no discriminar, y ha salido anteriormente también, ¿no? En la medida que unas víctimas o unos sufrimientos se sienten fuera, ¿no? Ahí hay un foco de conflicto, ¿no? Pero también las verdades más micro, más verdades de historias de vida, de lo que nos ha supuesto, y desde ahí, pues desde la cotidianidad. Y que son estas pequeñas experiencias, estos pequeños procesos, que no significa que se tengan que reproducir en todos los ámbitos de la sociedad, pero sí que generan una transformación o un movimiento, ¿no? Por ejemplo, en un pequeño municipio que era conocido como la pequeña Belfast en el País Vasco, después de que se empieza un proceso con ciudadanos, porque los partidos políticos no son capaces de poder hablar de estas cosas, o sea, no llegar a acuerdos, de hablar de estas cosas, el que unos ciudadanos lo hicieran, de alguna forma interpela a los responsables políticos, que sienten una responsabilidad política respecto a sus ciudadanos, que están cubriendo un papel. El que los representantes políticos de todas las fuerzas políticas consigan hacer un camino juntos y llegar a pequeños consensos de reconocimiento a víctimas, hace, bueno, que se generen otros procesos entre víctimas, entre aquellas que se sienten que quieren hacer esa aportación porque sienten la necesidad, ¿no? Yo sí, no sé cuál es la vía, no sé cuál es el camino, no sé cuál es la llegada. Creo que hay un gran componente de transformación, de cambio, de relacionamiento, de más honesto, más respetuoso, más corresponsable también, como se hablaba aquí, ¿no? de hacernos cargo de la historia, que no solamente es de una parte, aunque cada parte tendrá un nivel de responsabilidad, y que en ese camino, por lo menos quien esté dispuesto a hacerlo, poder hacerlo, no exigírselo a todo el mundo, pero con la certeza de que cuando alguien lo hace, influye en los demás también, ¿no? Pero desde esa humildad de lo pequeño, porque realmente, bueno, es otra dimensión.
Maybe complementary thoughts about the relation between truth and reconciliation that maybe could help linking what you were doing, Alciber, and also Brandon, what you were saying. Probably we can talk about different dimensions about truth, and maybe also wording can help us a little bit. I sometimes try to distinguish from the concept the Latin word veritas, which we have identified as the coincidental reality between our internal conviction and the external, let's say, reality. And we talk about veritas, talking about this correlation between, that could be individual or collective, but our internal conviction of what happened there according to the facts that externally we have, let's say, agreed. But this, as you were saying, it's unaffordable. It doesn't exist, and it's impossible to afford. And maybe the ancient word aletheia, which is the correlative for veritas in the ancient Greek, give us a more accurate wording of that, which is related of uncovering what is hidden or what is intentionally covered. So linking with that, probably what Brandon was also saying, I completely agree. Maybe we have to create complementary context so that this hidden truth comes to light. And we probably need judicial contexts and non-judicial contexts or extrajudicial contexts, and to be complementary. For instance, if we go to the former Yugoslavia statute of the court, international court, and the Rwandan one, we see that it's basically coincidental, and the wording reconciliation is used as a main objective of the justice procedure. Of course, making truth possible. But there's a crucial difference between the former Yugoslavia court and the Rwandan court, which, you know, it's the basic ad hoc tribunals after Nuremberg, and established under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, is that in the former Yugoslavia statutes, there was no limit term for investigations. But in the Rwandan court, it was established in November '94 that the temporary competence was between January '94 and not yet finished the year '94. The UN decided that the limit of the competence was to be December '94. This meaning that what happened later on was out of the competence of the court. So is that an optimistic tool to achieve reconciliation as an objective, knowing that there will be impunity according to this international court of what happens after 1st January '95, after a peace agreement when UN was present at that moment. So maybe the concept and the wording of aletheia can help us to bring a complementary tool between some kind of judicial investigation, institutional investigation, for those who don't want, let's say, to admit, to uncover the truth, or to accept a kind of huge responsibilities in huge crimes as genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and at the same time informal or institutional ways, but extrajudicial forms as truth commissions, audiences, public audiences, local meetings of aletheia, or whatever wording we may use.
Having been an expert on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is just in the formative stages in Nepal, it has not given its final report or has not started investigation. There are not only cases of murder or disappearances, there are also cases where people register petitions that my house was destroyed by the state security forces or by the insurgents and I need reparation. And in this kind of a thing, you need experts from engineers, architects who can go to the site, look at the houses, and whether or not this was actually true. So in the case of Nepal, we have 55,000 registered cases at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. 55,000 of them are not only related with murder and disappearances. They are also got to do with property problems, houses being destroyed, property not returned, money not returned, and how do you really go about it, because it's a very technical matter, very difficult to implement. So therefore, I think we really need expertise and knowledge sharing from other experiences as to how to go about it, and that this is one of the reasons why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is very slow, because these things take a lot of time to resolve. May I also mention that the state security in most of our countries, the army and the police are very well educated people. They are trained in US war colleges and in most cases in the United Kingdom at Sandhurst. They know issues about human rights abuses. They are trained and they are well educated. The way the crimes have been committed, there is absolutely no proof. The person has been disappeared and there is nothing at all to prove that this person has been exhumed or been assassinated or killed by the state security. So how do you really go about it? There are family members who say that my father or my uncle was arrested by the Nepal police, but this person has completely disappeared without any trace of any proof. So he was completely burned down or done something with. So this needs expertise and international expertise and experience sharing. Thank you.
Bueno, en el caso español, muchas cosas se intercruzan en lo que se ha dicho, ¿no? Por ejemplo, yo no sé si sería posible o si sería factible una comisión de la verdad en España, por lo que comentábamos antes. Pero lo que está claro es que se tendrían que buscar, bueno, no sé si tendrían que buscar pruebas documentales que sería imposible acceder porque los archivos están cerrados. Es decir, antes he visto este libro y lo he cogido y es muy interesante y lo quiero mirar con calma, pero hay un montón de archivos a los que no se puede acceder para hacer esta historia tan necesaria y conocer esta verdad que me recuerda mucho, o no verdad, que me recuerda mucho y se ha dicho muy a menudo de que no hay una sola verdad, pero me recuerda al concepto, bueno, el concepto histórico, lo que decimos en historia, de que la historia es siempre contemporánea, porque la historia, al hacerse siempre desde nuestro propio presente, pues va variando su interpretación respecto al pasado. Entonces, quizá toda generación necesita construir su propia visión de lo que sucedió en el pasado. Quizá por eso en España ahora estamos en un momento, antes se ha dicho si estamos en un conflicto, yo tengo la sensación que estamos en un conflicto. El País Vasco está saliendo, o creo, quiero pensar, o creo, ¿no? Tengo la sensación, por lo que cuentas, que está saliendo de un conflicto, pero estamos metidos en otro muy fuerte respecto al pasado más lejano, que se remonta a la guerra civil, pero también respecto a un presente que no se puede desligar de este pasado y de cómo se realizó esta transición, que sin querer juzgar, pues posiblemente es un relato que también ha triunfado, pero posiblemente se llevó a término como se pudo, ¿no? en su momento. Y si estamos en conflicto, también, por lo tanto, yo he de decir que no puedo ser objetiva, ¿no? Porque también cuando se habla de futuro y de relatos unificados o un mismo futuro, aquí hay visiones muy diversas de un futuro español, ¿no? Y entonces esto pues también me hace pensar que el conflicto en el que creo que está España, político, básicamente, que tiene raíces históricas, es muy difícil de solucionar, a pesar de que se tiene que ir hacia allí, entre otras cosas porque bueno, pues algo tan factible, tan evidente como los archivos, ¿no? Y los archivísticos lo dicen, ¿no? Es decir, un grado de la democracia de un Estado se puede medir en función del acceso a los archivos que se tiene, a estos históricos. Y aquí están absolutamente cerrados y ha ido a más este hecho de cerrar esta documentación. Bueno.
I really appreciate that you bring up the issue of archives, because I meant to mention it before, and then I forgot. One of my PhD commission members was Vladimir Tismaneanu, who headed the commission in Romania. And one of the first things that this is to investigate crimes under Ceausescu, and one of the first issues that they encountered was the complete blockage of files, of national files. And then when I started working on the commission in Tunisia, the first barrier that was encountered by the head, Sihem Ben Sedrine, is when she tried to get access to the files, and she was blocked by the president as well. So access to file, I never thought about it as an indicator for democracy, but definitely as an indicator for whether or not there's political will behind the process or not. And the other thing is it's not just about archives, but how they're retrieved and through what mechanisms. Because there's certainly traditional mechanisms in place that might not function in tandem with truth processes, but there's other ways in which information can be gathered. And that's my point about truth, which the point I want to make is not more from an own academic perspective. I don't think there is one truth, and otherwise, if there was one truth, we wouldn't have, centuries of academia and research and everyone involved in trying to, on a daily basis, uncover alternative explanations and alternative truths. So there's a certain level of conflict that defines, the systems that we work in. However, one mechanism that I think has been really interesting across cases that I'm familiar with in reconciliation processes is the involvement of society and culture, even though it's not on the technocratic and on the procedural side, but the way in which societies themselves have been dealing with it through things like the Apartheid Museum in South Africa or the Museum of National Security in Tunisia, where former victims of state crimes function as tour guides and take visitors through the actual process of being tortured and through the process of being questioned and so on. And those initiatives are quite large, but they're usually not subsumed under reconciliation processes because they're kind of kicked aside to culture. And in a recent interview with a commissioner in the Truth Commission in Tunis, who's now kind of placing all their hope into, because it's so difficult for them to institutionalize the process because of the lack of political will, because of lack of access to archives, because of lack of cooperation by the court system, including special chambers that were established to investigate these crimes. A lot of hope is put into these kind of more societal level cultural processes. And so I wanted to bring this up because it is point number 4 in the discussion points that you raised in the program.
Like maybe to ask somebody of our Spanish friends, there was this effort during the Zapatero government to have some kind of memory work. Maybe you can explain to our international guests about this initiative and how it worked and why it didn't work as it was intended.
Bueno, muy resumidamente, una comisión sobre todo estudió cómo afrontar o cómo poder afrontar el pasado y la demanda social que existía, y se creó al final, todo se llevó a crear una ley para el reconocimiento, conocida como Ley de la Memoria Histórica, en el año 2007, pero es una ley que fue muy criticada por la misma sociedad que había presionado para conseguir esta ley, porque básicamente, excepto algunos aspectos muy concretos respecto a reconocer, por ejemplo, brigadistas internacionales que pudiesen pedir la doble nacionalidad o cosas muy concretas, el Estado trasladó toda su responsabilidad a la sociedad civil mediante la otorgación de subvenciones o bien a las comunidades autónomas para que aplicasen las leyes correspondientes. Entonces, a pesar, yo por eso decía antes de que cuando ha habido un gobierno más favorable ha sido con una actitud muy débil, porque a pesar de que se vio como un cierto triunfo en su momento, luego se ha demostrado que no fue, que fue muy parcial y además todo dependiente y en función de las posibilidades y la voluntad de dar estas subvenciones, trasladando a la sociedad civil las actuaciones. Y luego yo creo que es un ejemplo de ley de las que muchas leyes que en España no se cumplen, porque la ley establece toda una serie de requisitos y de cuestiones respecto a monumentalización, respecto a símbolos, respecto a cuestiones para que no se repitan, de enaltecimiento del franquismo, y no tenía aspectos punitivos. En este sentido no recuerdo bien, igual tú recuerdas mejor, pero creo que no tenía aspectos punitivos, económicos, no sé, y bueno, esto ha hecho que la ley la ha cumplido quien ha tenido voluntad de cumplir la ley, pero ya está, no ha habido más.
Para agregar algo, entiendo que la ley tampoco fue, digamos, acordado entre las diversas fuerzas políticas. Entonces no se cumplió uno de los requisitos que fue mencionado para digamos, tener cierto acuerdo a nivel político.
No, yo creo que la ley fue muy discutida antes de ser aprobada y la verdad es que no recuerdo quién la votó, pero creo que la votaron la mayoría de los grupos políticos, con lo cual ya es un ejemplo de cuando ha habido un cambio de gobierno, a pesar de existir la ley no se ha seguido y haberla votado, ¿no? Pero hubo bastante consenso en el Congreso al respecto, pero es que era más simbólica que... Con el tiempo se ha demostrado, ha sido necesario que pasase el tiempo, pero más simbólica que real y efectiva.
Brandon, and then I will ask Farid again to try to wrap up this second block.
Thank you. I didn't mean to have the last word, but you know, when I think about reconciliation and the question you asked at the beginning about truth and other processes, judicial processes, there can be a tendency to use this sort of cumulative type idea of reconciliation, that reconciliation is made up of these components, truth, justice, reparation. For me, it's much more about what you do with those things. I think it's why Ulrich's points are really important about once you learn about the past, once you open the files, it's not just opening the files, the reconciliation process, what happens once you do that? What happens when you open them and you discover these very complex truths that now have to exist inside of your society? Or if you grant reparations, it's one thing to grant reparations, it's quite a different thing in terms of whether somebody feels reparation has been made. That's a very different process. So for me, the idea of reconciliation is much more tied in with the sort of process of what these initiatives actually lead to. And to try and sum them up to say, truth is the road to reconciliation, to me is not really that, is a bit nonsensical. You know, it's a mechanism in the same way as saying if we prosecute people we'll get reconciliation. Well, it's the process of what follows that could take years and years and years, and that's much more of a psychosocial type of a process. I mean, I come from a psychological background, so if you think of something like procedural justice, if you're a lawyer, you look at that and say, were the procedures followed? Was it objectively delivered? Well, that's one measure, but another measure is, does the person who was part of it feel that that was objectively fair? That's quite a different process, and I think in societies that are deeply divided, we're often dealing with the latter. So we can turn around and say, we delivered trials, we delivered justice, we opened the archive. Actually, it's all the bits that happen after that that's much more long-term, much more complicated, where we're balancing those tensions, where we're trying to develop a society where we don't just have one narrative in the past, but actually we can handle and live with the fact that people have multiple narratives at the same time.
Well, I think that's very appropriate from a psychosocial perspective, now handing over to a legal closure, perspective closure to this block.
Okay, thank you. I think the question that we're being asked is whether the truth is important for reconciliation, and there has been a discussion about what the truth is. There were different presentations. One of them was about healing and the importance of truth for healing. And the debate is whether truth can heal or can expose the country to problems. And one comment that was really interesting in the presentations is the fact that there are alternatives, explanations, and alternative truth. And I think that is important because I would say that is a dangerous statement. Because either there were 100 people in Trump's inauguration or 100,000 people. So there is a truth about that. So there might be, and Brandon said that there might be different narrations or different narratives of the truth, but at the end of the day, we have one truth. And this is what the discussion is about. But people were discussing about whether we can understand the truth as veritas or we can understand it as aletheia. But at the end of the day also, we have, if aletheia is uncovering the truth, so we have to determine whether what is uncovered is the real truth. So at the end, the discussion is about truth as correspondence. And there is a whole discussion in philosophy about that. So there is the discussion about truth as consensus or truth as correspondence. And from an analytical point of view, people would say that the only truth that we can find is truth as correspondence. So only one truth. In legal studies, there is a discussion about judicial truth, historical truth, and consensual truth. But at the end of the day, when we talk about judicial truth, people say, okay, this is not the real truth because the historians are the one who knows the truth. But at the end of the day, if you want to do justice to a situation, you have to do justice to what really happened. So either Farid killed someone or he didn't. So we cannot say there is a narrative that Farid killed someone and there is another narrative but he didn't. So in one case we do justice to Farid and in another case we don't do justice to Farid. So the discussion about the truth is important because it seems that truth and reconciliation commissions are basically about truth as consensus. And I think that is a discussion that is important because again, I think it's not just consensus. It's not a consensual narrative. It's something that we agree on the truth. So there was discussion about the expectation of victims in Guatemala, that they weren't satisfied. There was one thing that Raquel mentioned that is really interesting is under situations of poverty and inequality, it's very difficult for people to care about the truth. So they're caring more about other things. Judicial procedures, they tend to lead people not to tell the truth because of the fear of consequences. So that is basically telling us that we need to find an instrument to find out what the real truth is and how to deal with that in a context of a structure of impunity. But this also leads to one problem that Ulrich raised, and it's the question of the principle of legality. So whether we can deal with the past violating the principle of legality. So the idea of nullo crimen sine lege, nulla pena sine lege, is basically the fact that we have to apply the law to situations in the past, and in doing that we can basically do injustice in order to bring about justice. And he mentioned the discussion about history, and when he was talking about that, I was remembering the discussion in the 1980s about the historians in Germany about the past. Now we have to deal with the future more rather than with the past, and that is something that is really important. So are we going to look at the past without thinking of the future, or are we going to look at the past just for the past's sake? And then we talk about the reconciliation in Nepal, and Nepal is presented as one successful case, but there was discussion about that. And one thing that was discussed is whether political normalization is just what is needed in order to get reconciliation. And one thing that was raised was basically the discussion about amnesties. So whether a society agrees in not having justice, and whether that is important for reconciliation, or if we need to eliminate the structure of injustice and impunity in order to have reconciliation. And Xavier talked about perdón, olvido, forgiveness, forgetting, truth, and reconciliation as 4 elements that we need to take into account, and there has to be a right balance between the 4 of them in order to talk about reconciliation. But it seems that at the end, the goal is forgive, forget, and truth in a right balance in order to have reconciliation. But then Daniel talked about real peace and reconciliation, and it seemed in his presentation that reconciliation is basically a surrogate of peace. So if we don't have real peace, if we don't have reconciliation, then we should have at least real peace. But it seems that the 2 of them are connected, so we need to have reconciliation in order to have real peace. And Ibs talked also about the need to talk about the future, so we could not only meet to talk about the past, but we also need to meet about the future, to talk about the future. And this is the discussion that we saw, what the goal of reconciliation is. So what are we talking about reconciliation? What do we need? Why do we need reconciliation? And finally, in Spain, it seems that there is no possibility of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Keral was talking about the archives and the fact that archives are closed, so we don't have access to that past. So the real history of what happened in Spain is unknown to us, or unknown at least in the official site. So there is a conflict about the past, and there is a conflict about the narratives of the past. But at the same time, there is a conflict about the narratives of the future, because without knowing the past, we cannot build a future. So that's it for now.
Well, thank you very much, Farid. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll have a break until 4. I do encourage everybody to think about something you'd like to highlight when we're back from the break. Not so much from your own context, possibly from what you have heard from somebody else saying, because I think that could be a nice way of trying to wrap up the takeaways from the discussions today. Thank you.